Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. From the triumphs of Austerlitz to the frozen retreat from Moscow, this memoir thrusts you into the heart of the action. These are his words. Let's begin. On the previous evening, the Fourth Corps had seized the bridge over the Eylau River after fierce fighting, thereby enabling the French to outflank the enemy's left. Recognizing this vulnerability, Benningsen retreated during the night via the Arendorf and Eylau roads. Thus, for the time being, we had to abandon our hopes for the anticipated battle. On February 4th, the pursuit resumed in 3 columns. On the right, Davout's Third Corps followed the Aller River, capturing Gutstadt, which contained some supply depots. In the centre, the Emperor advanced with the cavalry and the 4th and 7th Corps. On the left, Ney's 6th Corps advanced along the Passage River. The enemy's rear guard fought continuously while retreating. Our marshal pursued them with his usual vigour, exposing himself considerably that day. General Gardanne was wounded near him. After a long and grueling day, we spent the night in the village of Scholitten. General Lestock, commanding the Prussians, was stationed on the left bank of the Passage. The 6th Corps, tasked with pursuing him, crossed the bridge at Deppen on the morning of February 5th. Lestock hastened his retreat to cross the Passage near Wurmditt on the road from Elbing to Königsberg via Eylau, leaving a rear guard of 4,000 men to cover his movements. The 6th Corps attacked them at Waltersdorf, overwhelming them completely. The Labasset Brigade distinguished itself particularly, as did 2 dragoon regiments under Marshal Ney's command. The day's results were 1,000 enemy killed or wounded, 2,500 prisoners, and the capture of significant artillery and baggage. Exhausted, we rested in Liebstadt. On February 6th, we crossed the Passage and reached Wurmditt. The march was uneventful, as General Lestock had gained a lead while we engaged his rear guard. Recrossing to the right bank of the Passage, we found ourselves on the road behind the Grande Armée. That same evening, Benningsen arrived in Landsberg, intending to make a stand. He stationed a strong detachment of infantry and cavalry at the village of Hof to secure his position. Murat's cavalry first scattered the Russian cavalry and then routed their infantry after stubborn resistance. A division of the 4th Corps completed the defeat. Unable to hold Landsberg, Benningsen withdrew during the night to Eylau. Our army reached Eylau on the evening of February 7th. A bloody engagement ensued at Ziegelhof with the enemy's rear guard, which retreated and was pursued into Eylau, where Napoleon established his headquarters. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney received orders during the night of February 6th to 7th to march toward Kreuzberg and advance as far as possible. The general alarm was sounded at dawn, and troops were kept waiting before departing. The alarm should be reserved for urgent situations, requiring immediate assembly and departure. After an 8-league march without incident, the 6th Corps traversed the battlefield of Hof, strewn with corpses, and halted at Landsberg. Since the Emperor's arrival, the Russian army had been steadily retreating toward Königsberg. General Benningsen seemed to be searching for a favourable position to make a stand and decide the conflict. Believing he had found such a position near Preußisch Eylau, he concentrated his forces behind the town. Hemmed in closely, he decided it was better to confront the enemy on suitable ground than to continue retreating and risk being destroyed piecemeal. Napoleon was unaware of this decision until the night of February 7th to 8th. Marshal Ney, equally uninformed, sent me to headquarters on the evening of the 7th. He reported his long march to Landsberg and indicated that he would continue advancing toward Kreuzberg the following day, driving General Lestock before him. This was the most important mission I ever undertook, and the most extraordinary in its circumstances, warranting a detailed account. I left Landsberg at 9 in the evening in a sleigh. Just outside the town, the horses fell into a ditch, and the sleigh halted perilously at the edge of a precipice, unable to move. Returning to Landsberg, I mounted one of my saddle horses. The weather was dreadful. My horse stumbled 6 times during the journey. I still marvel at how I managed to reach Eylau. The town presented a horrific scene. Vehicles, troops on foot and horseback, wounded soldiers, frightened inhabitants, and general chaos, all compounded by nightfall and heavy snowfall. At the Major General's quarters, I found remnants of supper being devoured by his aides de camp and helped myself to a portion. Having received orders to remain in Eylau, I spent the night sleeping on a plank, with my horse tied to a cart, still saddled and bridled. On the morning of February 8th at 9 o'clock, the Emperor mounted his horse, and the battle began. At the first cannon shot, the Major General ordered me to return to Marshal Ney to report on the positions of both armies and instruct him to abandon the road to Kreuzberg, veer right, and form the left wing of the Grande Armée, establishing communication with Marshal Soult. This mission provides a striking example of how tasks were carried out at that time. One can appreciate the importance of ensuring Marshal Ney arrived on the battlefield. Although my horse was entirely incapable of moving at anything more than a walk, I knew it was impossible to object. So, I departed. Fortunately, I had 25 gold louis in my pocket, which I gave to a soldier leading a horse that seemed fit for the journey. The horse was unruly, but spurred on by my persistence. The remaining challenge was determining the correct route. Marshal Ney was supposed to have left Landsberg for Kreuzberg at 6 o'clock. The shortest path was through Pompiken, connecting to the Kreuzberg road. However, General Lestock was positioned near the Marshal, and I could not risk falling into enemy hands. I was unfamiliar with the terrain, and finding a guide was out of the question. Requesting an escort or a horse was equally unthinkable. An officer was always presumed to have an excellent horse, know the area, avoid capture, and arrive promptly at their destination. This was taken so much for granted that a second messenger was not always sent. Knowing all this, I decided to return to Landsberg and then take the Kreuzberg road, reasoning it was better to arrive late than not at all. It was around 10 o'clock. The 6th Corps was several leagues from Landsberg and already engaged with General Lestock. I finally reached Marshal Ney at 2 o'clock. He regretted my late arrival, but acknowledged my efforts and agreed I could not have done better. He immediately moved toward Eylau, entering the line at the end of the battle, just as night fell. General Lestock, drawn to the battlefield like us, had arrived earlier. If not for the obstacles I faced during my mission, we might have preceded him, a far more advantageous outcome than arriving after him. What had occurred during that dreadful day, of which I witnessed only the beginning and the end? I will summarize briefly, as is my habit. On the morning of February 8th, when the battle began, Napoleon had only the 4th and 7th Corps, the cavalry, and the Imperial Guard at his disposal. The 3rd Corps, Davout, was on the right at Bartenstein, less than 4 leagues away. The 6th Corps was on the left, heading toward Kreuzberg, as previously mentioned. According to Monsieur Thiers, Napoleon had sent several officers on the evening of the 7th to summon Marshals Davout and Ney to the battlefield. This claim is incorrect regarding Marshal Ney. He received no such notice and was unaware of the battle until I reached him at 2 o'clock on February 8th, en route to Kreuzberg. The Russians were arranged in 2 lines ahead of Eylau, facing the town and backed by strong reserves, with cavalry on the flanks and 300 cannons covering their front. On the French side, the 4th Corps held the left and occupied Eylau as an advanced bastion. The 7th Corps, Augereau, formed the centre, stretching from Eylau to the village of Rothenen. The 3rd Corps, Davout, was expected to arrive on the right near this village. The battle began with a terrifying cannonade that engulfed Eylau and Rothenen, causing heavy losses on both sides, endured with heroic courage. Napoleon awaited the arrival of the Third Corps, Davout, before making his decisive move. The corps appeared on the far right, pushing back the enemy's vanguard. The 7th Corps advanced between Eylau and the 3rd Corps, but was decimated by artillery fire and forced to retreat. The Russian infantry advanced toward the centre of the French position, but a remarkable effort by the French cavalry repelled them. The 3rd Corps, locked in fierce combat, began to outflank the enemy's left. General Lestock arrived from Kreuzberg, momentarily stabilizing the Russian position, but his efforts failed to regain lost ground. Marshal Davout held his position. Exhausted, both armies might have resumed the battle had Marshal Ney not arrived at Schmoditten on the Russian right. Fearful of being outflanked, Benningsen directed an attack on this village, which was energetically repelled by the Liga Bel-Air Brigade, 6th Light and 39th Regiments. Benningsen then decided to retreat. Unaware of this decision, Marshal Ney, like the rest of us, believed the battle would continue the next day. As the last corps to arrive, and having not participated in the action, the 6th Corps would naturally be the first engaged. A miserable hut at Schmoditten served as the staff's meeting place. The peasant who lived there had been killed, though I know not by whom or how. For supper, the Marshal shared a poorly cooked goose with us. He urged us to rest, predicting a battle the next day. "If necessary," he said, "I will fight on foot, sabre in hand, and I hope you will follow me." We assured him we would be proud to fight, and, if necessary, die alongside him. Then he lay on a plank and slept deeply. On the morning of February 9th, as I have said, the enemy had retreated. The 6th Corps was ordered to occupy Eylau and its surroundings. Before entering the town, we visited the battlefield. It was a horrifying sight, literally covered with corpses. Gross's famous painting offers only a faint idea of it, though it truthfully depicts the ghastly effect of rivers of blood spilled over the snow. The Marshal toured the battlefield in silence, his face betraying deep emotion. At last, turning away from the gruesome scene, he said, "What a massacre, and for no result." We returned to Eylau, whose sombre appearance did nothing to soften the impression left by the battlefield. The houses were filled with wounded soldiers who could not be tended to, the streets littered with corpses, and the inhabitants had fled. We ourselves had nothing to eat. The weather was atrocious, and those who have experienced war know how such conditions amplify fatigue and intensify deprivation. Yet, we had to pursue the enemy retreating behind the Pregel River to protect Königsberg. Prince Murat pursued the Russians to the Frisching River, a small stream flowing from the lakes to the sea, 4 leagues ahead of Königsberg. The 6th Corps, less fatigued than the others, followed as the advance guard, while the 3rd and 4th Corps marched slightly behind. Now, what course of action to take? Should the pursuit of the Russians continue, or should the army fall back into winter quarters? The Russians, positioned behind the Pregel and in Königsberg itself, were preparing for defence. The city, fortified with artillery and hastily constructed works, could offer resistance. Success would mean the conquest of all Prussia, trapping part of the Russian army in Königsberg and forcing the rest to retreat beyond the Niemen River. But failure would expose us to severe setbacks. To understand, one must grasp the material and moral condition of the French army at this point, a situation that historians have not adequately explained. Here was the state of the forces under arms at the beginning of February, at the resumption of hostilities. Marshal Lannes, 5th Corps, 12,000 men. Marshal Davout, 3rd Corps, 18,000 men. Marshal Soult, 4th Corps, 20,000 men. Marshal Augereau, 7th Corps, 10,000 men. Marshal Ney, 6th Corps, 10,000 men. Marshal Bernadotte, 1st Corps, 12,000 men. Oudinot, combined grenadiers, 6,000 men. The Imperial Guard, 6,000 men. Murat's cavalry, 10,000 men. Total, 104,000 men. It is evident that since the beginning of the campaign, the army had been reduced by a third. The Sixth Corps, in particular, which had not participated at Pultusk or Eylau, and whose vanguard alone fought at Jena, now had only 10,000 men instead of 20,000. This reduction occurred even though 12,000 recruits had gradually joined the various corps, and all the horses in Germany had been commandeered to remount the cavalry. During February, the army suffered further losses from diseases and skirmishes. At Eylau, it sustained 10,000 casualties, including 3,000 deaths. I know that 54,000 French soldiers faced 72,000 Russians, that our 200 cannons contended with the enemy's 400, and that the Russian losses amounted to 30,000 men. Nonetheless, our own army had been considerably weakened. In reality, the losses were even greater. There were 60,000 absentees, most of whom were marauding. The motivation for pillaging was not solely greed. The need to secure food often seemed to justify it. Napoleon issued more orders than ever to ensure his army's subsistence, but they were poorly executed. Some were even unfeasible, exposing the illusions or exaggerations of the man who would one day command peasants to bring provisions to the markets of Moscow. Directives to uncover hidden supplies, import goods from Warsaw, repair ovens and mills, establish regular distributions, and create reserve depots appeared well conceived on paper. However, those who participated in this campaign know how little of it reached us. It is incorrect to claim that the army had sufficient supplies, and sometimes more. On the contrary, I can affirm that despite well-issued orders in January, our corps was starving by March. Napoleon himself occasionally acknowledged this reality. "We are in the midst of snow and mud," he wrote to his brother Joseph, "without wine, brandy, or bread." However, to reassure the public, concerned about the soldiers' suffering, he wrote to the Minister of Police, "I have enough to feed the army for a year. It is absurd to think there could be a shortage of wheat, wine, bread, or meat in Poland." Yet this meat often consisted only of suckling pigs, whose unhealthy flesh caused dysentery, even among our staff officers. The stragglers, by ravaging the countryside, deprived the army of resources it could have obtained systematically. They increased the burden on soldiers who remained under the banners, forced to perform the same duties with far fewer men. Some questioned whether they were being duped, while others lived more comfortably. The example set by marauders became contagious. The cold soon intensified their suffering. By late February, the thermometer dropped to 10 degrees below freezing. Discouragement and despair particularly affected the cavalry, whose horses could barely endure. Unlike the infantry, which requires only bread and shoes, the cavalry also needs shoeing and fodder for its mounts. In these conditions, the Cossacks became particularly formidable. Their horses required less care, and both man and beast were accustomed to the harsh climate. Napoleon decided to withdraw and return to the cantonments we previously occupied, albeit with modifications I will describe. Some of us even expected to retreat beyond the Vistula. Given the army's exhaustion, both physically and mentally, such a move seemed inevitable. Napoleon, however, judged otherwise. Crossing the Vistula would have been an admission of defeat. Conversely, resuming the old cantonments could be justified as a necessary measure to give his troops rest after an incursion in which we had the upper hand. This allowed preparations to be made for decisively concluding the struggle in the spring. The retreat began on February 17th. The Sixth Corps, reinforced with a cavalry division, was tasked with serving as the rearguard. We departed from Mühlhausen and arrived in Eylau without being harassed. On February 18th we moved toward Landsberg. The Emperor had left an officer in Eylau to oversee the transportation of the numerous wounded housed in the city and its surroundings. However, bad weather, transportation difficulties, and the condition of many of these unfortunate souls forced the abandonment of a significant number. That day, I was tasked with accompanying General Colbert, who was covering the retreat. We departed last. The road was littered with carts and wagons of all kinds, stuck in the snow. Many wounded soldiers, taking refuge in these vehicles, begged us not to leave them behind. I even managed to prevent the explosion of 2 ammunition wagons off the road, which were about to be blown up when I noticed they were full of wounded men. The general sent an officer to recommend all these unfortunate men to the mayor of Eylau and the commander of the Russian vanguard, whose Cossacks were already occupying the town. I soon returned to the marshal at Landsberg and managed to get some rest after such a painful and distressing day. Marshal Ney moved to Freimark on February 19th and then to Gutstadt on February 20th, where we stayed for 8 days. On February 28th, we withdrew to Allenstein, with the vanguard halting midway between Gutstadt. On February 22nd, I delivered dispatches to the Emperor in Osterode, a journey as arduous as any I've made. Snow fell continuously, the weather was dreadful, and I feared my arm had frozen. Even the headquarters suffered from shortages. Benningsen pursued us from a distance with a considerable force. He boasted of never having relinquished the offensive, declaring himself victorious at Pultusk and Eylau, and acted as though he were pursuing a defeated army. Napoleon decided to counter him, to demonstrate that our retreat was voluntary and to deter him from disturbing our cantonments. Already, Dupont's division had captured Braunsberg at the mouth of the passage. On March 2nd, the Emperor ordered the 6th Corps to take Gutstadt, which the enemy abandoned, leaving behind some supplies. We pursued them along the road to Heilsberg. Our skirmishers drove the Cossacks out of the village of Schmoleinen. The enemy retreated through the forests, separating Schmoleinen from Peterswald. The engagement lasted nearly the entire day. Casualties were not heavy, though we mourned the loss of Monsieur Talbot, aide-de-camp to General Dutaillis, an officer of great merit who combined all the virtues of society with exceptional military qualities. Headquarters were established in Gutstadt, with the vanguard in Peterswald. On the 4th and 5th, there were additional skirmishes at Peterswald and Zeckern. The Russians then withdrew to their winter quarters, as we did to ours, which were organized as follows. In December, the corps of the Grande Armée had been concentrated around Warsaw. This time, the city was deemed sufficiently defended by the Poles, Bavarians, and the 5th Corps, where Marshal Massena had replaced Marshal Lannes. Napoleon therefore positioned his army forward of the lower Vistula, behind the passage, with Thorn to the right, Elbing to the left, Danzig in the rear, the centre at Osterode, and the outposts between the passage and the Allee. The distribution of the corps was as follows. On the left, the 1st Corps, Bernadotte, on the passage, from Braunsberg to Spaden. The 4th Corps, Soult, in the centre, at Liebstadt and Moerungen. The 3rd Corps, Davout, between the Alle and the Passage, at Allenstein and Hohenstein. The 6th Corps, Ney, at the vanguard, also between these two rivers, at Gutstadt. The imperial headquarters were at Osterode. The cavalry was stationed in the rear to recover and feed their severely depleted horses. From this position, Napoleon could advance toward Königsberg and outflank the Russian right if they moved on Warsaw. Alternatively, he could easily concentrate his entire army if they dared attack. At the same time, this arrangement secured the siege of Danzig, a critical operation conducted over the winter. The army remained quietly in its cantonments for 4 months, with the Russian army facing us, their outposts within sight of Marshal Ney's. Thus ended the winter campaign. I pause here, as the following spring campaign held no significance for me. I will add a few reflections on the impression these events made in France and Germany, which I have recounted. As I mentioned earlier, after the Battle of Pultusk, the Emperor's prestige, if not destroyed, was at least significantly diminished. This winter campaign would have brought glory to anyone else. Benningsen, defeated at Pultusk, sought to surprise our cantonments. 2 weak army corps resisted him. The Emperor himself had arrived to defeat him at Eylau and push him back to the walls of Königsberg. This would have been a significant achievement for anyone else, but it was insufficient for Napoleon. For him, a defeated enemy had to be destroyed. An incomplete victory seemed like a failure. At Pultusk, Bennigsen retreated without being pursued, and though after Eylau he had fallen back to the walls of Königsberg, he emerged only a few days later to follow Napoleon, who was now retreating in turn. Finally, Bennigsen had audaciously established his cantonments facing ours. This certainly was not the behaviour expected of the victor of Marengo, Austerlitz and Jena. The report of recent events worried Paris and France almost as much as news of a defeat. Malicious rumours amplified our losses, the suffering of our soldiers, and the still threatening stance of the Russians. Napoleon's correspondence with his ministers shows that he was keen on disproving these often exaggerated reports. Yet even in his rebuttals, he sometimes went too far. "When I bring my army back to France," he wrote to the Minister of Police, "people will see that not many are missing during the roll call." This was an extreme exaggeration. If the news from the army caused concern and agitation in France, one can imagine the impression it created in Germany, especially in Prussia. To fully grasp it, however, one must understand the country's suffering, something hard to imagine without witnessing it firsthand as we did. I mentioned earlier how impatiently the people of Swabia endured the prolonged presence of the French army. If our demands seemed intolerable to our allies during peacetime, how much worse were they for our enemies during war? The passage of troops alone would have sufficed to exhaust the land. We were fed at will, and a regiment lodged in a village took everything for itself, without concern for those following. New arrivals were no less demanding, and this passage of troops repeated daily. These were, however, unavoidable misfortunes, but there were also marauders roaming the countryside, extorting money, cloth, horses and vehicles, imprisoning locals until their demands were met. Some using open force, others brazenly claiming to collect contributions, fabricating false orders, and even donning epaulets and decorations. Add to this the legitimate contributions imposed by Napoleon, regular taxes and extraordinary levies, and the moral suffering of a people humiliated by seeing Prussia conquered, and conquered so quickly. Then one can understand the impatience with which news from the army was awaited, and the eagerness with which unfavourable reports about us were received. This agitation was especially noticeable in Berlin. The police barely managed to suppress the circulation of pamphlets against Napoleon, and false reports spread with malicious delight. General Clark, governor of Prussia, diligently worked to curb these efforts. He was equally strict with the French who committed the slightest misconduct. It was a duty of justice and humanity, and this sense of justice served our interests by showing the inhabitants that we sought to impose only the inevitable burdens of war. Returning to my personal story, I now have nothing of greater interest to recount. My circumstances had somewhat improved, despite my limited means. I had managed to acquire 2 additional mounts, though mediocre ones, alongside my Isabella horse. I was adapting to my new role, and after completing missions as grueling as the ones I've described, none could intimidate me anymore. My relations with my comrades were most agreeable, and the Marshal showed me kindness. Yet in the last days of February, a strange sadness took hold of me. Though I do not believe in premonitions, I have always regarded it as the harbinger of the misfortune that was about to befall me. The harsh, cold, poor food, and the soldiers' misery alone could have explained my mood. I had not yet witnessed a retreat. I had not seen our wounded abandoned in the snow, nor our wagons falling into enemy hands. The death of Talbot affected me deeply. His excellent qualities endeared him to us all, and he showed me particular friendship. That day he seemed troubled himself. When the Marshal sent him to deliver an order to a battalion a mere 100 paces away, he asked in a dazed manner where the battalion was. The Marshal irritably pointed it out. Talbot left, and a cannonball shattered his hip. I happened to pass by him at that moment. I can still see his noble face, barely altered by pain or the approach of death, and I can still hear the gentle, affectionate tone in which he said to me, "Goodbye, Montesquieu." The next day, we attended a service for him in Gutstadt's church. The sight of a church, where we rarely entered, religious ceremonies, and prayers for the dead moved me deeply, rekindling sentiments in my heart that had faded but never extinguished, and heightened the unease I had felt for days. On the morning of March 5th, the day of the final skirmish, we were stationed at the outposts in the village of Zechern. The Marshal sent me to Marshal Soult in Elditten, between Gutstadt and Liebstadt, to inform him of the engagement from the previous day. General Dutailis outlined my route through Mauern, Freimark, Arensdorf, and Dietrichsdorf, indicating Freimark was more than imprudent. This point, well outside our outpost line, could have been occupied by the Russians. But, as I have mentioned before, without maps, we were always unaware of our position and that of the enemy. The directions given by the Chief of Staff seemed reliable, and I neither dared nor thought it necessary to request clarification. For 2 days I had been riding an excellent horse taken from a Cossack officer, a fortunate acquisition that had boosted my morale and confidence. So I departed with a hussar and a guide, not knowing that I was bidding farewell to my comrades in arms, nor anticipating where this ill-fated mission would lead me. That concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.